Hello, and thank you all for coming out on a hot afternoon like this. But you've made a good decision. You've chosen the right place to be. Because last year, somewhere in the middle of the year, I think Gita Ramaswamy's publisher, S. Anand, sent me her book as a PDF and asked me if I would like to write a recommendation on it. And I actually discovered a book that completely blew me away. It is a story that every one of us needs to read, whether we are Indian or not. Emily Perkins is over there, so even New Zealanders will benefit from reading this book. I believe it is one of the first of its kind. The story itself is explosive. It begins with a young Brahmin girl and from a very intelligent young woman in the University of Hyderabad, right? Osmania or Hyderabad? Osmania University, who gets drawn into an underground movement, the Naxalvad movement, the Naxalite movement. Her parents respond with the kind of brutality that can only be based on deep love. In India, when we really love our children, we are very brutal to them. So they locked her in a room in order to persuade her to give up her political allegiances. When that didn't work, they took her to a psychiatric hospital. They had electric shocks administered to her, which left her with a legacy of mental illness for the rest of her, in recurring episodes for the rest of her life. But she stoically bore all that, went back to work with the Nakshals, and then walked away from them to become. But anyway, I think I'm telling the whole story, Geeta, so it's time for us for you to actually pick up the story from there. The subtitle of your book says Memoir of a Lapsed Revolutionary. I can't see where the lapse happened because you still seem pretty revolutionary.
Well, lapsed in the sense I left the underground movement, I left the Naxalite movement. So normally revolutionary is considered someone who is like actively in the field, actively participating in some kind of armed struggle. So in that sense, revolutionary, but I'm not justifying the title. I mean, my publisher thought it's an apt title, and it's not that I consider myself lapsed either. There are some things you can do when you're young, and some things that you can do when you're older, and we do what we can to live a life that we think is satisfying to ourselves.
So after the moment when you were with the underground movement, when you came overground as it were, you went off to work in Ibrahim Patna, and you were working with landless laborers, helping restore, I think eventually 40,000 acres. 14,000 acres of land to the people who'd been tilling it but had never been given the right to it, or who had been because of their caste or because of various factors had been removed from the land. Would you like to just tell us a little about that time? Because it's some of the most, this sounds like, that Gita would be one of those self-satisfied, revolutionaries who's helping the poor, but it is such a beautifully recounted thing, including how difficult it is for a woman to take a shit in rural India. You have not read a book like this, trust me. Just tell us about that.
I went to work in the villages, because I wanted to see, I had changed the way I thought my life would be, because I wanted India to change. I wanted inequity to go. I wanted some semblance of social justice, and I wanted to be part of that movement. And when I thought that the Naxalite movement had failed in these objectives, or that it was not going to go further, I wanted to see whether I could on my own do some work in a smaller area in a different way. Was it possible to do this without violence? Was it possible to do this within constitutional? There was no law and order as we envisage it. There is only the law and order as it is enforced by the local, the landlord, the Reddy, the Dora, as we call it there. the laws of India didn't seem to work. There was a law for minimum wages, there was a law against bonded labor, and there were procedures by which the police could arrest, or you could file a case with them, you could, ask for justice. None of these were followed in any sense there. So one of the first challenges I had in front of me was when I talked about minimum wages. They were getting wages from anything between 8 annas. I don't know, 8 annas is 50 paisa. I don't know if there's some of the younger people would even know what a 50 paisa is, because there is no 50 paisa coin nowadays. So the women would get something as low as 50 paisa. The men would get 2 rupees for a whole day's labor in the sun. And minimum wages at that time in this area where I worked was 8 rupees. So I brought forward whatever the act was, the rule, the section, and I said, look, this is what it says. And then in one village, I really don't know how it happened, but the agricultural laborers, the bonded laborers, I mean, who get as less as 30 to 60 rupees a month for this 24-hour work, decided to strike. They sat down in the village square in a kind of a circle, and I sat with them. And for 3 days we talked about, whoever came and asked, what were you doing? We talked about the law, and we said, this is, not followed, and they want higher wages. And there was a lot of discussion, because even the landlords came to, argue with us. So the 3 days were intense discussion, and after the end of the third day, minimum wages were not paid, but 2 rupees became 4 rupees. And the women got 2 rupees. So it was a victory of sorts. And when this came to be known in other villages, then there was a spate of strikes which took place, and village after village struck work. And so this became a kind of a movement in which, there was no going back for me. There was no going back for me, because I started getting involved with the people and their lives, and the challenge was now like, really, it was not an abstract challenge like, sitting in a hall and you're wondering what I can do. It was a challenge right there, right in the village where I was living. It was a challenge in front of me. Can you continue? And that is what I did. So that's how it started off. And then it took off into so many, none of this was planned in a way, I did think of the constitutional framework, and I thought one of the first things we must do is explain the law, get the law into the village. Let the people own the law, because the law is made for people. So let the people own the law, explain the law, and get the law into the village. And after this, I found out that strikes were difficult, because there was this huge presence of what we call bonded laborer. I think you had this in Kerala some 60, 70 years ago. In fact, I think Kerala had slaves, if I'm not mistaken, at the turn of the century. They were actually slaves who were tied to the land and the landlord. But we had something like, if you take a loan from a landlord, till you paid back, you were paid this very bare minimum, like 30 to 60 rupees a month. On that wage, you can neither pay back the loan nor the interest on it. So you're stuck working. Your grandfather worked for him, your father worked for him, you continue to work for him. And it's a work which, go in the morning at 4 o'clock, or you have to sleep over in the field, there are no holidays. You're literally tied to the person. And if you have to leave him, you have to pay back the entire amount with interest to the landlord before you can even think of leaving him. If you run away, there were many runaways, like, the black slaves ran away in the US. There were many people here who just ran away, younger men who were just married, who couldn't spend a night with their wives, sometimes just ran away. And they were caught eventually, because people would know, the landlords would know where they would have gone. They were caught, and then they were made to bend over with a huge stone on their backs. Or their father was caught, their uncle was caught, their brother was caught, this huge stone on their back, and they had to kneel till their head touched their feet. And then they agreed to sign away whatever other asset they had, or put another person in bondage under the same landlord. So in these kind of oppressive circumstances, even agricultural labor strikes were rare, because the bonded laborers broke the backbone of any strike. If there were 100 agricultural laborers, there were 20 bonded laborers. So the landlord could do without, these were the scabs, right? So then that is when we decided to take up the bonded labor issue. We formed a trade union. We had an agricultural trade union. at that time, it seemed best to unionize the people, and the trade union laws of the country also give enough scope for work within the constitutional framework. So we set up a trade union of agricultural laborers, took up the bonded laborer issue, and many other issues which came up, workers' compensation, back payment of wages, and in that way we broke the backbone of the landlords in that area. In I think in about 2 years, we broke the backbone of landlords in that area, quite successful, and there were many, the areas which are contiguous to the area in which I worked also wanted to take up this issue, and I think slowly it spread, and in all of southern Telangana where I worked, this bonded labor practice gradually stopped. In the same area, meanwhile, the struggle deepened in the sense of people took up the issue of land entitlements. I mean, I'm sure in Kerala too you have this issue, that land everywhere, government has passed land reform laws, but these laws are largely on paper because those who own the properties know how to evade those laws. You transfer the land under Benami names, you sell the land to someone and then you buy it back later, you divide it among minors, among people who don't exist. There are various ways in which you can circumvent the land laws because the bureaucracy is also very pliable to landlords. I mean, the bureaucracy is also formed of the landed class. You didn't have at that time like you have now. 30 to 40 years ago, there were nobody from the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes who were there in the bureaucracy, very few of them. So most of the bureaucracy composed of the landed people who helped their own community to retain land. So the next issue which we took up, I mean we also took up unknowingly, didn't know that this was going to be such a enormous fight, was that of land entitlements, and that is where various categories of land, we did not just petition. I mean we went beyond petitioning to direct action. Direct action is the sense of actually cultivating the lands, resisting landlords' attempts to destroy the crop, destroy his crop instead. And that direct action helped us, I think, a more militant form. We were not violent, though having come from the Naxalite movement, I was more keen on violence than the villagers were. Because, there were easy solutions. Burn down the way he keeps his cows, cattle shed is easy to burn down because his thatch, put his motors into the well, put sugar into the tank of his car. There were many things but the villagers would never, to tell you the truth, villagers never agreed to anything. They said none of this will lead anywhere. It's a slow fight, long fight, but we're doing the right thing. Let us do the wrong thing. Let us not doing this quick thing which you want to. Because I used to get at my wits' end, every issue was so difficult, but they never lost patience, they never lost sight of what they wanted to do. So finally at some stage, I think at the end of 6 years, the landlords began compromising. That is, they said this was like a headache. See, along with the direct action, what we also did was we had a social boycott of the landlords. They had their big mansions in the village. And the big mansions need to be swept. It's 1 acre of courtyard. I mean, a lot of dust, a lot of cattle. You need cows to give them milk. Nobody would milk the cow. Nobody would pick up the dung. Nobody would clean the courtyard. No barber would give them a shave. Nobody would come to wash their vessels. Yeah? No labor to work on their fields, in their poultry farms. And some of them had petrol pumps, agricultural business. All the labor would desert because it was a social boycott. So once the social boycott became effective, then the landlords decided, this is too much of a headache. And there was always the threat of the Naxalites. Let me be very clear. At that time, in that part of Andhra Pradesh where I was working, the Naxalites were active in nearby areas. And there was always the threat that if you did not compromise with people whom you could talk to, then there'd be someone else who'd come here and, bump you off, shoot you or something like that. They thought we were easier to negotiate and talk to. So that's when they came to negotiate, talk, and compromise in the sense, give up the land which was not rightfully theirs, involve government in the transfer the rights to poor people. So to that extent, This is the 14,000 acres that Jerry just talked about. And along with these land-related, wage-related activities, we could not ignore other, people need to live, people need to eat, their children need to study, they need to go to a hospital when they are not well. So there were many what you'd call developmental activities that we took up in the sense of entitlements from government. Government gives you a loan to build a house. Government gives you a loan to buy cattle, to run a small business. And usually these are considered as doles by the local landlord or the MLA. And so we cut at the root of political patronage, and we said this has to be done in a fair way, in a transparent way, in front of the whole village. The whole village has to sit down and decide who are the poor people, among the poor people who needs houses, who needs a loan to do something. And so the entire thing was built in a transparent way in which a lot of people could access many of the entitlements which government had for them, to such an extent that the area in which we worked, which is about 60 villages, cornered most of the government funds for the entire district. I mean, the other MLAs complained because the schemes worked so well here. There were no middlemen, there were no contractors. People took up the building of the houses. People paid what they had on time. And so the lower bureaucracy is happy when the schemes function well, on time, on schedule. They were happy to give funds here. So these were some of the other activities which took place. But I think more important than all these, what you'd call material things, I mean, when I look back after 30 years, what I see is some kind of comradeship among the people across caste and region. Usually when people gather at the weekly shandy or at some place, they talk with their relatives and people of their community. Discussions don't take place across castes, but because people of all the marginalized castes participated in the meeting, in the meetings and in the direct action and demonstrations, they learned to discuss with each other all kinds of political issues. So now when I see that in these villages, somebody from the toddy tappers community he sits with somebody from the cobbler community and is able to talk. They go to each other's weddings, they attend each other's functions, they take part in political, other political actions like, minor elections, etc. I think that kind of space was created to break the back of a certain caste rigidity which is there in village society.
Thank you. I mean, my next question was about something that you said earlier about how movements didn't really have space for people. They had space for another kind of hierarchies. Did you also find that movements had sexism involved?
Oh yes. Even our movement, it helped because I was a woman. And it helped because, I don't want to call myself a feminist, but I am an active campaigner for women's rights. If I see any if I know of any incident where a woman's rights are being trampled upon, I step in, immediately. But even in our agricultural laborers union, while women formed the bulk of the agitating people, in the leadership, inside a village there would be women active, but when it came to intra-village councils, outside the village councils, women were rarer. There was a certain fear of if a woman, and the women who were inside the village leaders were also people who by 40 had completed childbearing, who had daughters-in-law. So they really had no, responsibilities, household responsibilities. But once they left the village and were moving around actively, there was this fear that she is going astray, she's having an affair with some ex-wife. Mainly this thing of once women are on the loose, they may have affairs with everybody. So there was this very silent control over women's activities. And however much I said, look, I'm going around everywhere, nobody is suspecting me of anything, why aren't you? Because you're a good person, as if, see, look at the way they looked at it. You're a good person, and our women, you never know who they sleep with. Yeah, so there was this very strong gendered leadership which was there, very difficult to break. Because you don't want to break I didn't want to break the thread. You want to pull the thread as far as you can, but you don't want to break it. It's important. It was important at that time for me not to break it. So those were the issues I dealt with.
And then you broke the thread yourself. You simply walked away. You discovered that, she writes that she discovered that she was being treated like a politician, that people were coming and talking to her very respectfully and asking for favors and asking for help. And she couldn't deal with this power anymore. And she walked away. I thought that was almost bizarre in its own this thing. I'd like you to talk about that moment when you walked away from this magnificent magical work that you were doing and decided to do another magnificent magical work, but we'll come to that later. Just let's talk about the moment when you said, okay, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, because I think there was a burnout, and I think we need more. I mean, I didn't have a support system. I wasn't known. This work of mine was private. I didn't you didn't see me in meetings. Nobody knew that I worked. Some of my close friends didn't know. They know I was in some village, but they didn't know what I was doing. And I wanted it private because I had seen earlier that many activists, when they work in movements, the activists become far more important than the movement is. The publicity is all about the activists, not so much about the movement. And I hated that kind of, it's a very disorienting thing. So I would refuse interviews, I would refuse to talk with anybody. So it was a very private work for me. But because it was private, I had no support. So when I was getting burnt out in the sense that, okay, now wages, we've achieved whatever was possible, decent wage limit. Lands, we've also come to, get whatever lands are there within the system. And beyond that now, the livelihood is not something which you can address in a small area. People need employment. And the habitat was getting so far, eroded so fast. I mean, how the trees were cut down. The chain, actually in Telangana we have the irrigation system, which is a chain of lakes. The water comes, fills the highest lake and then comes down to the lowest lake. But because of encroachments, all these, the chain of lakes was being broken. There wasn't water. When there wasn't water, people let the land be fallow. People let the land go. They cut trees for wood. They just cut trees for wood. And then they gave up sheep rearing because, it's even now even more that the younger people don't want to work in the village because they are getting educated. They don't see why they should rear sheep and sit in a village like some, shepherd. They like to also come around in a city, sit like this in meetings, which I think is fair enough. So there was this crisis of livelihoods and the habitat being destroyed. What does one do I had no way to go forward. I didn't know what was to be done. And meanwhile, I was getting personally very important in the area in the sense that the movement was now we were able to defeat the MLA who was always being elected. So that was a big victory for us. We were not able to put up our own candidate. We knew we couldn't win, but we could defeat. So whoever we voted against would get defeated. That was established, which means it was a big political victory. Nobody wants to now tamper with poor people any longer, file cases, get you beaten up in police stations. That kind of repression stopped. And so I was getting important, and I didn't want to get important because there's this in the early communist movement, the Naxalite movement that we entered, we always felt that power corrupts. Now whether or not it corrupts, I don't know, but there's this kind of Spartan attitude to power that you stay far away from it. And I didn't want that, the power is there, but I don't know what to do with the questions which are there in front of me. So I said, it's a no-go. I mean, I have nothing else to do. I don't want to do anything. I actually went around the state for a year to other groups, other areas to find out, could I find an answer somewhere else? Could I find allies? But I couldn't find allies for this kind of a movement because nobody wanted anything to do with police or any difficulties. People want the NGOs or NGOs want an easy life. You know, somebody puts a proposal, you get funds, and you do some small activity, and you write a report and be done with it. And then the political parties which are even left, which talk of these issues, don't want to go through the grind of examining each issue, the legality of it, how do you process it in the revenue courts, in the civil courts, how do you provide people with logistic support and get the issue to fulfillment. I mean, the thing is to raise a slogan and then, you know, whatever happens, happens. But what we did was actually bring the issue to fulfillment. So I found no allies there. So I said, yes, you know, I mean, it's just time to walk away, and I walked away.
Would you like to talk a little about the impact, since we've, you know, moved across feminism, etc., of having a child and that in your mental health and those issues in the kind of narrative of your life?
My daughter is sitting in the audience.
I think she's a very forgiving sort of daughter. So
yeah. So after this, I never wanted a child earlier. I mean, it was an accepted fact that if you're going to be an activist, you can't have children. Because we've seen the lives of so many women getting messed up when they have children. What happened in the Naxalite movement was when a woman got pregnant, and of course you do get pregnant because all the methods of contraception are not fail-safe, yeah? And then they are asked to leave the baby in at the dead of night in the village crossroad or near a tree with a small letter asking whoever picks up the child to look after the child. Or sometimes they give up the baby to some distant friend or a relative. And these were horrifying cases because, I mean, how does a mother live with this? I don't know how the father lives with it, but I know the mothers who lived with it have never been able to live this, take this. All had very huge problems. So the idea was never to have a child. But when I had this burnout and I sat back and said, I'm not going to do it, then suddenly there was this urge to have a baby. I mean, I was 40. And maybe something to do with the biological clock, and maybe everybody is saying, have a baby. Because Indian society is always sitting on women's heads to have babies. I don't know what it's got to do, but 30 years ago, if you didn't have a baby, you were like nuts, you were like insane, you were like really eccentric, or maybe you couldn't conceive. Maybe your husband should marry someone else so that 3 of you can have a child. All kinds of insane suggestions. So maybe all those worked, and then there was a small incident, I saw... I'd gone to a friend's house and I entered here, the baby was here, the mother was there. And the baby ran, she was a 1-year-old baby, ran from here to where her mother was. She ran in such desperation, and I said, my God, I have, so many people love me, but there's no one who needs me as desperately as this baby needs her mother. I wanted that kind of...
Get a dog.
Yeah. So I had this baby, and the baby changed my life for after whatever happened, after I gave up work and after I had the baby, my life took a very different turn. And as Jerry Pinto says, I struggled through, I came back to my publishing work. I publish in Telugu. All our publishing is not for profit, what you broadly call alternative literature. I came back to publishing after a time, but I had to grapple with a variety of mental health issues. I had to grapple with not being, full-time activist who can sort of, do anything. The night there's a call and somebody's been arrested, you can just walk off and, go wherever it is and do something about it. But with a baby, you can't do, you learn to constrict your life. The baby rules your life, the child rules your life, and even after the child is grown up, she rules your life you're a mother, you're defined now as a mother. And the saddest thing is, mothers don't have, again, support systems in society. Once you're a mother, you're sort of, put in a corner, and the corner is not visible to everybody. I'm talking of a metaphoric corner. You're sitting in a meeting like this and your child cries. Everybody says, choo, choo, choo. Where's the child? What do you do if you have a child and you want to come to a meeting? If you're in a bus and the child cries, everybody looks at you as if, you're beating the child or doing something to it. There's not a support system for a mother, and you're not recognized as, you're bringing a child into this world is bringing value to society. You're raising a child which is going to be of If mothers didn't have children, what would society do tomorrow? So it's recognized as a work of no value except for the family. And that's very difficult to take because you're isolated. And at 40, I didn't have the kind of support systems normally women have. You have the natal family, you have your mother and your sisters helping you to cope with a newborn. You have friends. All my friends have children who are 20 years older than my own daughter. So there was really no help in that way. And that led to a whole lot of, my mind was then open to so many other issues which are there in society, but which I won't talk about right now.
She said, looking at me threateningly. And I remember once chatting to Gita. I suspect you know that I think this is a magnificent book and you should all buy it. But I remember talking to her about her publisher, and she looked at me and she said, I told him, come to Hyderabad, I'll break your arms and legs. So after that, I've been very respectful. Whenever we are on stage together, I go where I think Gita wants me to go. I'd just like you to talk about the process by which this became a Navayana book.
Oh, yeah, I'm not a writer really, yeah?
No.
No, I've only written where something had to be written. It couldn't not be written.
Okay, I just add here. This is one of those maybe old-fashioned things that she needs to save to herself. But one of the successes of this book is that its material is magnificent. It is really startling, but it is also written very well. It is written so well that the craft vanishes. You don't notice how well it is written until you sit back and think, oh my God, I got through 90 pages and I didn't feel it was 90 pages. So this is actually about writing as much as it is about story. So now stop this act, not to write.
Yeah. No, in a sense, okay, I try to write as I speak because I've always found that when we speak, we speak to someone. I try to get across my point to you whose faces I see. So when I write, I also want to write to someone. And this particular book wasn't written as a book. My husband passed away 6 years ago after a long, debilitating illness. And the period after that was very difficult for me because, we've been married 42 years and your partner is gone and you're suddenly on your own 2 feet. And I had a mild thing of depression. When I went to my psychiatrist, she said, think of the happy times that you've had. Why don't you write about them? And so I thought, which is the happiest time? And this part where I worked with the villagers was like something in which I was immersed in so totally that, there was hardly a sense of self. Or the sense of self was sort of so acutely aware of the other selves around them. I thought this was my happiest period, so I actually sat down a month and a half and I wrote the first draft of this book, and then I felt happy and said, yes, I've done, and it makes me feel happy, and now I'm ready to get on with work, and I put it aside. This was in 2017. And then Corona came in 2020. 20 is March, is when suddenly, the office was closed down, there was nothing you could do. I had taken my dogs and gone to stay with a friend. She had a cook, she had, help in the house. So there was really nothing I had to do. This is when I picked up the script again and said, can I do something with it? I don't know, it's a very vague idea. And then I reworked it, and my second draft, I sent it to a friend in Delhi who actually publishes Ambedkarite literature. This book is not Ambedkarite in that sense at all. So I didn't send it to him for publishing, but I sent it to him because he's a critique. He's very critical of whatever anybody does, anybody. So he'd be critical of what I do. So I sent it to him and said, how does it read? And then maybe the next morning or the morning after that, he calls up and said, I'm publishing it. I said, it's not, I didn't ask you for publication. He said, no, you don't know what, this is something so good that it must come out as a book.
This is one of the few times I completely agree with Anand.
Yeah, and I think he sent it to reviewers and everybody said this was something so good, and so we worked on it. The third draft was when they put in a lot of work. Anand and his team put in a lot of work, and then we got out this book that you see. So much of it is also the effort made by my publisher, who fell in love with the book and decided that we must give it the best we've got, and also pushed me to I wrote it for myself in a way, or for people around me. So I didn't explain what was going around. I took it for granted that everybody knows what happens in a Telangana village. So he made me add all those things. He said, think of someone in New York who's reading a book, think of someone in Haryana who's reading a book, and so make all those things intelligible. So that's the work.
I would have said, think of someone in Delhi reading your book also. I mean, we are all in some ways fundamentally illiterate about what happens in a village. If you're living in a city, you don't know. So what was the most difficult thing about writing the book?
About writing the book itself? Yeah, the first draft or the third draft?
First, second.
Oh no, it was not difficult at all. It was... No, honestly...
I just write these elegant books and throw them off.
The first draft just came out because I had to work out my unhappiness and get over my personal tragedy. The first draft. The second draft was, I was curious. I'm a publisher myself. I read a lot. So I wanted to know, I'm coming back to it after 3 years. Who was this person who wrote it 3 years ago? I was a little curious. Can I work on that draft again? Who am I now? There's this constant questioning within oneself. The third draft was tough because he gave me 1,000 and over queries. And he'd want to know the initials of this. He'd want me to fact check everything. So that was tough because every question had to be answered fairly. But after I wrote this book, and before the book was out, I have two other drafts which I've got ready, and those were also easy to write because those were my life experiences. I think when something it's different from writing a work of fiction, and when you write something which is to do with one's own life, then it's different. One's own life, the only difficulty is, am I being honest? That's the biggest difficulty you have to face. What is someone... See, I've named people, named everybody in the book. I've named my close friends who've done wrong by me. I've named my family. And so that's a tough call because you've got to see them again tomorrow. You don't want to lose those friendships. You don't want to lose those relationships. But if you're not honest, the reader is going to know immediately there's something she's hiding. You see, you have to be totally upfront about who you are and what your life is if you want a reader to connect with the book. So that, I think, was a tough call. But it's a lesson well learned now that I can't hold back anything. I'm sure now that if I write anything, there's nothing I can hold back, is what I've learned.
Gita has 2 other books in process, or at least I hope they are in process, because I really think this is an important voice in a way. One is about, would you like to talk about those 2? And commit to writing them. Now come on, time.
Yeah, one is about the mental issues I faced all through. Even in the book, I talk about when I left the Naxalite movement, I went through a suicidal phase. And at that time, I thought this was normal because, I'd given up everything. I'd cut off with my family. I'd given up my studies. And I thought, we're going to change the world. And then suddenly the party which I thought it was wasn't what it thought it was, and the world now in front of me was so bleak. There was nothing in it. What was I to look forward to? I couldn't go back to the life I had earlier because that vision was lost. I was ambitious when I was a student, but I no longer wanted to have a good job or become an IAS officer to do. Those were not the things I wanted any longer. So what was I to do? I was suicidal in that phase, but I thought maybe lots of people go through it. And then later I found, of course, many other women who left the Naxalite movement also faced similar situations. Now I learn. And then after the shock treatment that I had, and after I had my baby, I had repeated occurrences of depression, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, and I talk about them freely. but I talk about them freely only since the last 10 years. You see, there's this great shame about mental illness as if it's some fault of ours. If I fractured my hand, you know, I'd happily wear a cast and you'd say, oh, you fractured your hand. But if I'm depressed and I'm not able to connect with you or I'm not functional, nobody's going to say, oh, you're depressed. They say, get along with it. Don't you have willpower? Can't you do this? Just get up every day and go on your work as if, you know, this is not another disease like something else which you've got. So I have made, you know, I reach out to people who also have issues, and in that discussion I find that I think one of the most important issues that we have to confront today is this denial about mental health issues, and we have to be far more open about them, transparent about them, because we can't just depend on medication and medical treatment to help ourselves recover. A lot of it has to come from society, from the friends around us, from family. And if these are to be healthy places to help recovery, then we should be open about the mental health condition. So which is why I thought my second book, the second draft which I've made, is about the mental health issues that I have faced and those of friends, and what I think of it as some kind of pointer to where we need to look at these issues, not in a medical kind of way, but what are the kind of support structures we need to build, how we need to look, etc. And then the third draft which I have ready is my husband went through a very long fatal illness. I mean, he was on oxygen for 2 years, and the doctor said, you know, he's going to die, just give up. And there was no way you can give up. I mean, you can't give up. You have to fight illness, you have to fight death. How do you do it in the face of a medical system which sort of refuses to recognize any kind of palliative or any kind of managing treatment? And during those 2 years, I had the help of an extraordinary set of, it was a Yahoo group of people from all over the world who have this particular illness, who helped us cope, manage, and my own friends, few doctors within the system, and the kind of jugaad we do in India, because there's a lot of jugaad, you don't get the equipment you need to really. And I had almost a kind of an ICU functioning at home. So the kind of jugaad we do. And I thought this book would also help people confronting progressive fatal illnesses, that there's no way you can give up. There's no way you can say, okay, someone is going to die, let them die. So how do you cope? How do you live? How do you guarantee some quality life to the person till his death, till her death? And how does the caregiver also, I mean, the caregiver also needs care. So how does the caregiver cope through all this? What are the kind of support systems you need to build around you? Because nothing is going to fall on your head. You have to create these, you have to reach out to people. So I thought that would be also helpful people, because when I see other people, families where there's this a crisis in healthcare, they just give up. They say, doctor said this, and then they just give up, and the whole family goes into a depression. I think we need to face even death like we face life, with some amount of dignity.
And we can only hope that both these books get written very soon. I'm opening to the audience right now. Please raise your hands. Keep your questions brief, please, so that we can get many people answered. The young lady in the front row in the green t-shirt, please. Then the young man behind her, and the man at the back there. Then there's over there the chap in the check shirt. Let's move zippity zap. Who's got the mic to give these people?
Madam, anytime during your time with the Naxals, did you meet Gaddar Galam?
Gaddar,
Not
yeah.
Gaddar Galam, Gaddar.
Gaddar.
Gaddar is a good friend, is a dear friend.
Front
We
row.
meet often.
Okay, so that's answered.
Once there was awareness about the payment, the wages and everything to the village people, and were there any challenges that you faced after they got to know the law? Like after they know that there is a law that will protect their equal pay, equal work, and then remove that bondage labor and all of that, were there any more challenges that you faced?
Yeah. I mean, nobody's going to accept just because there's a law. Am I a fool to pay higher wages? Am I a fool to let my bonded labor go just because someone in Delhi writes a law? Nobody's going to give up. There were lots
Ask yourself whether your household help gets wages, gets fair and decent wages. Probably not. So while we think about like the farmer, we are paying our own staff rubbish. So we are thinking about like landlords while we are behaving in the same way. Your question,
Hi
sir.
ma'am, you talked about in two places that you can kill someone and I'll acquit you. But to get justice from the courts is not something I can help you with, especially the civil law system. Then you also talked about, I just saw that CJ Ramanna has talked about your book. And that's a huge story. I have to congratulate you for that. My question is, the RTI movement also took place along the time that you did work.
Which movement?
The RTI movement.
Yes.
So now the RTI is fully functioning. Do you think that has helped, and would that help the people much more?
No, the RTI movement, yes. I think that there's the RTI movement worked towards bringing in a new act that would help the people. I was working towards actualizing the laws which were already in implementation. So even when when they were organizing for the RTI Act, one doubt I always had is one more act, how is going to help when acts are never implemented, right? But then RTI, I think the kind of support which has come for RTI all through, the kind of activism which has gone all through, has proved me, I mean, I had suspicions at that time, all were proved wrong. RTI has, I think, done wonderful work in being actualized, but that is also because you don't have a concrete enemy, you don't have a concrete victim. When you have victims and enemies, then the fight is not just, it's physical.
Good evening, ma'am.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
Where I teach, I encourage the students every year. Each student has to file one RTI just to see what it's like. Everybody here, please file one RTI. It doesn't even matter if it's a traffic issue. File it. Use what you've got.
First of all, thanks a lot for that nice and lively discussion. My question is something related to the question posed by that young man also, the same thing. You are talking about working within the framework of constitution, right? So, to what extent we can rely on a constitution which has got its own nature, or may I say, a kind of a class nature or whatever it is, the possibility of getting justice and all those things. That is my first question. Second question is, I would like to know your opinion about the present relevance of Naxal movement as a whole, and have they changed their opinion about, giving up children, as you mentioned, it was too disheartening. I would like to know those things also.
The first about the constitution, we can only sort of go further when you've gone this far, in a sense that when you haven't explored constitutional methods at all, how can you say that the constitution has limitations? That's my first question. I would question those who question a constitutional framework, that how can you, when you haven't explored, how can you reject that? The second thing is, why we also say constitutional is because of the issue of violence. Now, if you don't follow a constitutional framework, one of your other alternatives is violence. Because you meet with violence when you're active, so you resort to violence. And now, it's just not now, 30 years ago, the state is far more equipped than you are, not just technologically, weapon-wise. You cannot fight the state with what you have right now. So if you want to meet violence with violence, I think Ambedkar, right in 46, he understood that you could not meet violence with violence at that time. I mean, India maybe, the kind it's diverse, the way it is constructed. Maybe in a country like Cuba, it was easier, in a day or two. Or maybe in China because of the particular circumstances. I'm not ruling out extra constitutional forms of change. But I'm saying unless you explore constitutionality fully, who are we to say that, we can't, that there are limitations to it? That's one. The second thing is, have I changed my views about the Naxalite movement? In my time, the Naxalites were far more idealistic than they are now. In my time, it was the flower of youth who came into the movement. They came totally because they were idealistic and wanted to change society, whatever, violent, non-violent, but they came with very idealistic thing. Later on, towards the 90s, if I had a fight with him in the village, I joined the Naxalite movement just to point a gun at him. It was no idealism, there was no need to change society. All kind of elements entered the Naxalite movement afterwards. So to change my, the Naxalite movement to some extent at least in the Andhra Pradesh state degenerated, if you want to say that. And the kind of violence that was inflicted on poor people, and all violence was inflicted on poor people. The person who was an informer to the police was not the landlord, who informed to the local constable or somebody who wanted 10 rupees for a glass of toddy. Yeah? And so this man who for 10 rupees, he told the constable that, today there's a meeting in the village and the Analu, the Naxalites are coming. He had his elbows and his knees broken. Broken, actually. They break the elbows and the knees so that he would crawl all over the village as a sign of people, there should be terror so that nobody would do it again. And all the people on whom this terror was inflicted were poor people. I mean, in the paper you may read, some sensational case of some rich person being killed, but 99% of the cases were those of poor people. There was a case where they set a passenger train from Hyderabad to Warangal on fire. They set the train on fire, and 97, who travels in a passenger train except for poor people? 97 people were burnt alive. So there's so many cases of atrocities by Naxalites. So in my time, what was really my time and a little later were idealistic people joining the movement. Later on it became like you wanted to carry a gun, chalo, you joined the Naxalites. Or you had a panga with, your neighbor or your cousin over a plot of land, or you wanted to grab someone's daughter, you joined the Naxalites. It became as degenerate as that. So I don't know, unless the movement, the Naxalite movement proves otherwise, I don't see why I should change my opinion.
One last question, I think, is all we have time for. Is there anybody?
I am a student at Delhi University right now, and the Naxalbari movement has its manifestations within student movements through institutions like ISA, right, All India Students Association. So how do you see the influence of Naxalbari growing within student circles and in central universities, following the legacy of Comrade Chandrasekhar in JNU and other leaders in DU as well?
No, I really don't know. I'm not following. I don't know what is happening inside universities, and I'm not competent to comment on that. I mean, I'm far away from universities. I wouldn't really know.
If there is no other question, then thank you, Gita. This was a wonderful conversation as always. And copies of Gita's book are available at the bookshop. She will be there to sign copies. Please follow the trail to the bookshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.